Hi everyone, Ian here, and in this episode I'll be looking at external spot metering utilising the zone system. So what is spot metering? Well, spot metering is a form of reflective metering, and reflective metering is when you measure exposure from the point of view of the camera. So instead of metering the direct light source, you're metering the object that the light source is hitting. The exposure is then calculated by the meter and gives your shutter, ISO and aperture values, and this will provide your exposure calculation. To utilise the spot metering method effectively, we need to understand the zone exposure system, which is integral to calculating the various exposure levels within a scene and the difference in the image's dynamic range. It proposed a technique for calculating and determining optimal film exposure across a range of luminance values, allowing the photographer to visualize and calculate how the light and dark areas within the image are rendered. The zone scale ranges from 0 to 10, and each number represents a stop of light, so 11 stops of light in total. At 0, the lower end, the stop of light represents pure crushed black. And at 10, the upper end, the light represents pure clipped white. Each number in between represents the various shades of grey which sit in between pure black and pure white, and these different tonal shades will be visible within an image when we take a meter reading. Zone 5 is where we reference middle grey, which is what a camera's line meter uses to determine exposure. So on either side of this tonal shade we have a ladder that we're able to move across. Now each number on the zone scale equates to a darkness and brightness range which can be quantified by a variety of common tangible materials, and this helps the user understand where that zone is meant to live within the real world. To ensure you're using the spot meter correctly, turn the dial located on the reflective meter to the reflective icon. This now means you'll be measuring light through the viewfinder as opposed to the incident lumisphere. Now I'll be showing you how to set up the light meter specifically for filmmaking, not photography. And I'm stating this because certain settings need to be set to specific areas which rarely change when using a light meter for filmmaking. Along the top we have our different metering modes. You'll want to choose the ambient mode. And to do this, press and hold the mode button and roll the jog wheel until the sun icon is selected. Across this ambient icon, you can select 3 different priorities: shutter priority, aperture priority, and EV. And while still holding the mode button, use the jog wheel when on the ambient icon to select one of these 3 parameters. When the T icon is present in the left corner, you'll be in shutter priority. When the F icon is present in the middle, you'll be in aperture priority. And when EV is present, you'll be able to determine the exposure difference between multiple calculations. Now ideally, I'd recommend being in shutter priority mode because we normally want our shutter speed to stay consistent across our shots for motion blur purposes. Now for film, you'll commonly be filming with a shutter speed that's double your frame rate. So either 1/50 as a shutter or 180 degrees. Now on the Sekonic L558, you can't set the shutter to 50, it's either 60 or 125. However, the meter does have a dedicated cine mode in which you can alter the shutter window to a frame per second mode. To do this, roll the jog wheel until it goes past 8000 and displays F/S instead of T. This is now displaying the frame rate that you'll be recording at, which will either be 24, 25, or sometimes 50 in the UK. When using this F/S reading, the light meter will be basing its exposure calculations on a shutter angle of 180 degrees, which is the optimal shutter angle for natural motion blur in cinema. So set this to 24, 25, or 50 F/S if you're in the UK, and if you were in America, you would be choosing 24, 30, or 60 FS. Once the shutter priority FS window is set up, you'll also want to set the ISO. And you'll want the ISO to match the camera's ISO, which should ideally be at or as close to your native ISO as possible. To adjust the ISO, press and hold the ISO button and then use the jog wheel to alter the value. and you can also do this for a second ISO if you want to. So let's put this into practice to show you how the zone scale works and how we can determine different tonal ranges. Okay, so in this example, I want to show you how you use your external spot meter with the zone exposure system to correctly calculate different tonal ranges and exposure values. And the simplest way to explain this is with 3 different colored cards. So we have a black card, a gray card, and a white card. And we're going to measure each one individually with the spot meter, and it's then going to tell us what we need to set our aperture to gain correct exposure. But remember, the spot meter is always going to be measuring these exposure ranges using the middle gray value. And while the gray card is going to sit in the middle gray range, the white card and the black card won't. So we then need to calculate and adjust the exposure using our zone exposure system chart. So that's what we'll do as we go through this demonstration. Now I've got the camera and the spot meter set the same for specific settings. So they're both set to 25 frames per second. They both have a shutter angle of 180, and they're both using an ISO of 800. So when we calculate our exposure, we're going to be adjusting our aperture. So first, let's put the spot meter onto the middle gray card and take a reading and see what it tells us. So I'm just going to place my spot meter across different areas of the gray card to get a reading. And across these different ranges, it's telling me consistently that my aperture needs to be set at around an f4. So I'm going to take my aperture and I'm going to adjust it to an f4. And we can now see that the middle gray card looks correct. And that's because the spot meter is measuring for middle gray and it's pointed at the middle gray card. So whatever the exposure value tells us, it's going to be pretty accurate and it's going to give us a really good baseline and starting point. So we don't really need to make that many adjustments when we're measuring the middle gray card to the spot meter. But what happens if we point this at the black card or the white card? So first, I'm going to point it at the black card, and again, I'm going to take some measurements. And across these different areas, it's telling me consistently that it should be set at around an f1.4. So I'm going to take my aperture and I'm going to adjust this to a 1.4. Now we can already see that this is starting to look incorrect. Not only does the black card look far too bright, but it's also meant the gray card and the white card are also heavily overexposed. And that's because the spot meter is trying to force the black card to sit in zone 5 at middle gray. And the black card shouldn't be sitting in middle gray, it should be sitting in a darker tonal range. So how can we calculate where it needs to sit? Well, a really easy way to do that is with the zone exposure chart. So if we take a look at this, we can see zone 5 has our grey stone, our middle grey, and things such as weathered wood. As we go down the tonal ranges to zone 4, it says landscape shadows, dark stone, and dark foliage. As we go to zone 3, it says very dark grey with distinct shadows and texture is visible. But when we get to zone 2, it starts saying textured black. So this is the darkest parts of an image where detail is captured, and it has slight detail in the shadows. If we go past zone 2, it then starts to say near black in zone 1, in which it lacks texture and detail. Well, I want this black point to still have texture and detail, but I still want it to be dark. So looking at this zone exposure system, I feel like zone 2 would be an ideal spot for my black card to sit. And between zone 5 and zone 2 are 3 stops. So that means that we need to adjust our aperture by 3 stops. And we need to do this by closing down the aperture to make the image 3 stops darker. Because remember, the black card is meant to be sitting in a darker tonal range. So I'm going to get my f-stop and I'm going to go for 3 stops lower. So I'm going to go f1.4 to f2, that's 1 stop, then to 2.8, that's 2 stops, and then finally to f4, and that's 3 stops. And we can now see that the black card is looking correct, the middle grey card is therefore looking correct, and the white card is looking correct, because these different tonal ranges and exposure values are all intrinsically linked. When you adjust for one tonal range, it's obviously going to adjust for another tonal range. So now we've looked at the black card and the middle grey card, let's have a look at the white card and see what the spot meter asks us to set it as. So again, I'm going to take some readings, and this is telling me consistently to set it to around an f11. So I'm going to take my aperture and I'm going to go to an f5.6, then an f8, and now an f11. And when we look at this, we can again see that the white card now looks too dark. And that's because the spot meter, which is calculating for middle grey, is trying to pull that white card into zone 5. And the white card doesn't sit in zone 5, it sits in a lighter zone or a brighter region. So how do we calculate it? Well, again, we can use our exposure chart. So if we look at zone 6, this is where Caucasian skin tones will sit and shadows on snow and sunlight. In zone 7, we can see that it's setting for very pale skin tones and very light grey objects, and shadows in snow with side lighting. And then as we get to zone 8, we have the lightest tones with texture, for example textured snow and clouds. As we go past zone 8 to zone 9, this is where it goes into glaring white surfaces. Now again, I don't want this white card to be glaring. I want it to be closer to textured snow or clouds. So the difference between zone 5 and zone 8 is again 3 stops. So I'm going to take my aperture, and this time I'm going to brighten the image by 3 stops. So I'm going to go from an f11 to an f8, that's 1 stop, then to an f5.6, that's 2 stops, and again back down to that f4, which is now taking us to 3 stops. So we've been able to use this spot meter alongside the zone exposure chart to calculate where the black point should be sitting, where the middle grey point should be sitting, and where the white point will be sitting. Remember, the spot meter is only going to be measuring for middle grey, so if you're using this external spot meter, you'll need to have some kind of zone exposure chart or understand the zone system to be able to measure exposure correctly across different objects or different tonalities. But this is obviously much more of a technical demonstration, so let's go out into the field and capture a landscape shot while using the spot meter and measure those different exposure values. Okay, so we're outside with a landscape scene and we've got a variety of tonal ranges. We've got some shadows, some midtones, and some highlights. And it's an ever-changing, more dynamic scene in terms of lighting. And with that brings some additional complexities that we need to think about when we're lighting outside. So on the A7S III, I currently have an ND filter applied, and it's a 2-stop ND filter. And this is going to be reducing the light. Now in photography, if we need to reduce light, we could always easily adjust the shutter speed. But with videography, we want to try and have as much natural motion blur as possible. So if we're shooting for 25 frames a second, we want a shutter speed of 1/50 or a shutter angle of 180 degrees. So it means that we're not able to adjust that particular parameter as easily. So instead, we need to use ND filters. However, the external spot meter doesn't have an ND filter built in, and it doesn't know that the camera has an ND filter applied. So what can we do to the spot meter to ensure that it's working in unison with the camera? Well, the camera's ISO is currently set to 200 and the external spot meter is set to 200. But because we have a 2-stop ND filter applied, the image is going to be 2 stops darker than what the external light meter thinks. So we need to make the external spot meter 2 stops darker. How do we do that? Well, we can take the ISO and we can make the ISO 2 stops darker. So currently it's set to 200, just like the camera. So I can go down 1 stop to 100, and then I can go to a second stop for 50. So now the ISO on the camera is 200 with a 2-stop ND filter applied, and the external spot meter is 50 on the ISO with no ND applied. And this means that we're now working from a more even level. It then also means we can use our zone exposure system in the same way as we did when we were inside. Now, to get the maximum range out of this camera, I'm also shooting in S-Log to try and retain as much dynamic range as possible. And that's going to help me to bring back certain areas of the highlights and the shadows and the midtones in post-production because I'll have more dynamic range. So let's take some meter readings. And initially, I'm going to look at the frame and look at what is most important within the scene. And we have these broken branches, which are quite prominent in the scene. So I'm going to measure those first. And if you look at my image on the camera, you can see the image is a bit too blown out. We've got an f-stop of 3.5. So we need to make some adjustments. So I'm going to take my spot meter and I'm going to take a reading. And it's telling me on that weathered wood, on those broken trees, that we're sitting at around an F16 or an F11. It's going between the two. For the majority, it's saying F11. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change my f-stop and I'm going to go to F11. Now you'll see this already is starting to look better. Now I've also got a LUT applied so you can see what it looks like after color grading, but I am working with a log profile. And you can see with that LUT applied that the image is now looking nice in terms of exposure. Now, because it was going between an F11 and an F16, this means we have a range in terms of our baseline, and we can choose one or the other and see which we prefer as our starting point. So for example, I could go to F16 if I wanted, but if I felt like this was a little bit too dark, I could go off that more prominent reading, which was F11. Now, because we are using an external spot meter and it's measuring for middle gray, and the weathered wood branches sit within zone 5, which is middle gray. So if we look at our zone exposure chart, we can see in zone 5 it says dark skin, gray stone, weathered wood, and middle gray cards. We know that because the spot meter is measuring for that particular zone and those objects are sitting in that particular zone, we know that the aperture value that it's suggested is a pretty good starting point. However, what about some other regions? Because we also have some highlight regions in the sky and we also have some shadow regions. Now, these are not the most prominent regions in the frame, so I wouldn't normally be using the shadows to try and measure for this scene, but we'll take a measurement anyway and see what it does to the image. So when I measure the shadows, they're sitting at around an f5.6 to an f8. So let's take our f-stop and we're going to adjust this to an f5.6. Now we can see that this is a little bit too bright. And this is because, again, the spot meter is measuring for middle gray, which is zone 5. And the shadows aren't going to be sitting in zone 5. If we look at our zone exposure chart, they're going to be sitting somewhere between zone 4 or zone 3, which is 1 to 2 stops darker. So if we needed to make adjustments, we would need to adjust our aperture by around 1 to 2 stops for those shadows to be correct. So we could go darker by 1 stop to f8, and then we could go darker again to f11 for 2 stops. And now we can see that the shadows are looking better in terms of their exposure, and that's also bringing the midtone region more into the correct exposure point as well. But we also have our sky as well, and we've got a range of clouds. And while it's not the central focus of the overall image, it is quite an important part of the frame, and we certainly don't want to be blowing out that region. or we don't want to be underexposing that region because it may mean that we're underexposing the rest of the scene. So in this scenario, I'm going to measure the exposure of the clouds, but I'm going to specifically pinpoint the areas of the clouds which are in shadow and have more detail, as opposed to the brightest parts of the clouds. Now I'm doing this because currently my aperture is set to f11 and my lens only closes down to f22 at its maximum, which is 2 stops darker than f11. If I were to measure the brightest parts of the clouds in this scenario, I know the spot meter would be suggesting an aperture value of f32, which my lens can't adjust for. So to ensure that I can show you the exposure adjustment properly, I'm picking a luminance value that I know can be correctly measured on the zone exposure chart, and work in unison with the aperture values that I've got available to me. So let's take a reading of that. So with that said, when I take a meter reading of the shadows sitting in the clouds, it does indeed recommend an f-stop of f22. So I'll adjust my aperture to f22 and you'll now see the image looks far too dark. And this is because I've exposed the clouds for middle grey at zone 5. But clouds in shadow don't sit at zone 5. They should be sitting in a different exposure zone. So we need to look at our zone exposure chart and check where our white clouds in shadow should be sitting. And if we look at it, we can see that at zone 7 we have a good exposure range for shadows in snow, which is very similar in luminance to clouds in shadow. And because of this, I think zone 7 would be an optimal choice based on the exposure point that I've chosen. And zone 7 is 2 stops brighter than zone 5. So I need to open my aperture by approximately 2 stops. So first, I'll go from f22 to f16, that's 1 stop. And then I'll go from f16 back to f11, and that's 2 stops. And we can now see that we have a great baseline exposure again. And because I'm shooting in a log profile and have plenty of dynamic range, I'm able to retain the shadows, midtones and highlights across the entire scene. Now, if I'd been metering the clouds not in shadow, which would normally be the lightest tones with texture in an image, then zone 8 would have been a more appropriate choice. But this would have been incorrect for clouds in shadow. So hopefully this has given you a better understanding of how to meter with an external spot meter in a lighting environment which is ever changing, and when using ND filters for videography. And remember, if you want to retain all of that dynamic range, remember to shoot with a log profile because you'll then have more adjustability and manipulation in post-production. Okay, so in the last scene, we were looking at exposure outside and we were primarily looking at landscapes. However, in this setup, I want to look at exposure of skin tones. And we're going to be looking at those on both a daytime scene and a nighttime scene. And we're using the virtual production studio because we can change between that nighttime and daytime setting. Now, because of this, I'm able to control a lot of the lighting. So we don't have an ND filter on the camera this time, which means the ISO of the external spot meter and the ISO of the camera are going to be the same. So the camera's ISO is currently set to 200 and the external spot meter is also set to 200. And we're going to be measuring our skin tones for Caucasian skin in direct sunlight for the daytime portion. Then when we go to the nighttime portion, we're going to be looking at exposing those skin tones in a darker environment where we have more shadows, and how and where these need to sit within that zone exposure system. So first, I'm going to take a reading of Matt's skin tones and see what it gives me. And again, I'm going to look across multiple areas of his face, and I'm going to be exposing for the broader side of the face, where the majority of the light is coming from. And this is telling me consistently that it needs to be set at an f4. Now, if we currently look at the camera's setup, we can see we're currently set to f11 and the image looks far too dark. So I'm going to click on the aperture and I'm going to adjust this to the f4 that it suggested. Now, again, the external spot meter is looking for middle gray, and Caucasian skin tones don't always sit at the middle gray value. If we look at our zone exposure chart, we can see that while middle grey looks at darker skin tones, greystone, weathered wood, and middle grey cards, zone 6 is where we have average Caucasian skin tones. So this means that our skin tones for matte should be a little bit brighter than that middle grey value. Now Matt does have a bit of a tan because he's just been away in Greece, and that might affect where we place that exposure slightly because he hasn't got very porcelain skin. But the spot meter is telling us to set it at about an F4. And again, that is exposing for middle grey. When we look at our image, we can see it's a pretty nicely exposed image. We've got good exposure on him, and the backdrop is also quite nicely exposed. If I turn on my false color on the camera, you'll see that his skin tones are sitting at that color green, which on false color represents middle grey. So we know the external spot meter is working correctly because it's also working in tandem with that false color scale. But because we know Caucasian skin tone should technically sit round about a stop brighter than middle grey, that means that we technically should be in zone 6. And that would mean opening the aperture and brightening the image by around a stop. So if I go to my f4 and I go to f2.8, we'll now see that we've brightened the image by a stop. Now, because we have enough dynamic range, we're able to retain plenty of information across this image, and we can still see visual detail in Matt's skin tones. And again, if I turn the false color on, you'll see that we now have the color pink occurring across those skin tones, which in false color scales represents the correct exposure in well-lit sun for Caucasian skin. Now, if you thought that this was a little bit too bright, this is where you can, of course, use this as a baseline and switch between that f2.8 or, in this example, the f4, based on the skin tone of the particular person you're shooting. So that's how we would measure Caucasian skin tones in well-lit environments at daytime. But what about at nighttime? And if we want to expose a little bit darker and keep skin tones more so in the shadows? Well, Dan, if you can now transition this to a nighttime shot, we'll then be able to do that. Okay, so we now have a nighttime scene, but I am going to have to change a few things on the external spot meter and the camera before we carry on. So first, I'm going to change my ISO from 200 to 800 just to give me a little bit more light. And I'm also going to do the same thing on my ISO on my spot meter. So I'm going to change this to also match for 800 because again, I'm not using an ND filter on the camera. I'm also going to change the Kelvin range as well because we're working at now a different Kelvin range of around 4000. And I'm just going to adjust my aperture again, and I'm going to bring it all the way down to f11 to make the image far too dark, just so you can see how the spot meter is reacting with the camera when we make those adjustments. So now we're looking at a scene which is in a darker environment, and Matt is sitting more in a shadow region. Because it's nighttime, we're not expecting that direct sunlight, so we're not expecting as much brightness on the skin tones. So let's take a measurement. Now, if I look at this, we can see that it is telling me to set this for an f2.8 consistently across the broadside of Matt's face. So I'm gonna go to my f-stop and I'm gonna open this to an f2.8. Now again, the external spot meter is measuring for middle grey at zone 5, and in direct sunlight, Matt's skin tones would normally be metered at around zone 6. Which is one stop brighter than zone 5. However, because this is a nighttime scene, and we'd expect the overall exposure to be darker than at daytime, our measurement at zone 5 already means that Matt's skin tones are one stop darker than his normal baseline. So this means in this setup, we've already exposed Matt's skin tones one stop lower. Now, if we look at our zone exposure chart again, we can see that zone 5 is the middle grey region, and this also represents our darker skin tones. However, when we go down to zone 4 or zone 3, this is where we have even darker exposure ranges, such as darker stone and landscape shadows. Now, based on how I want the scene to look, and because we're trying to expose for a nighttime scene, I'd prefer matte skin tones to be sitting a little bit lower than zone 5, probably closer to zone 4. So I'm going to close down my aperture to f4, which means matte skin tones will now be sitting in zone 4. And if I continue to close the aperture and go down to f5.6, you'll see that matte skin tones would now be sitting in zone 3, which to me feels a little bit too dark. And we need to balance both matte skin tones and the rest of the scene. And of course, this will always be based on personal preference and the contrast ratios that you want across your scene. Now, if I turn on false color when our exposure is sitting at zone 3, we can see that the overall scene is dark and retaining detail, but matte skin tones are definitely a bit too dark for my liking. So if I dial to zone 4 at f4, we can see that the skin tones are a little brighter and the overall scene is also a little brighter. And although some specular highlights are beginning to overexpose, visually we have an overall better balance. So remember, always use your spot meter as your baseline and base it around the types of skin tones you have in the frame, the types of objects that are in the scene, and the types of environments that you're trying to expose for. Okay, so in the last segment we were looking at Caucasian skin tones, but for this segment we're going to be looking at darker skin tones and how we expose for them across the zone exposure system. So I've got the daytime shot set up again, and I've got the lovely Anderson West here, a phenomenal filmmaker. So if you want to check out any of his content, I'll leave a link in the description. So we're going to be looking at how do we measure for those darker skin tone variances across both a daylight scene and again a nighttime scene. Now the camera once again is set to ISO 200 and the external spot meter is also set to ISO 200. And we're going to be using our zone exposure chart again. So when we looked at Caucasian skin tones, we were setting them at zone 6, which is one stop above zone 5, which is where middle grey sits. But if we look at the zone exposure chart, we can see that darker skin tones are meant to sit in zone 5, the same zone as middle grey. And this makes it really convenient when we need to measure those darker skin tones, because we don't have to make any calculations and additional adjustments when we're initially using the spot meter. So let's take a quick reading of Anderson. And again, we're going to do it on the broad side of Anderson's face. And we're getting consistently round about an f2.8. So you'll see on my camera, if I go to my aperture, currently we're set to f11, so the image is far too dark, and we move it to that f2.8, we'll see that we start to get a much better exposure across Anderson's skin tones. Now again, this is just going to be a baseline exposure. We can then make alterations based on the overall scene and the rest of the light coming into the scene. But as well as the main f-stop, I also want to mention the additional points that occur when you're using a spot meter. You have the main aperture value, which the spot meter is going to give you, but then you'll also have some additional spot exposure points after that value, and they'll range from 0 to 9. Now, when it says something like 0, that means that it's going to be incredibly close to the larger f-stop value, which is showing on the spot meter. As it goes up in value and up incrementally between that 0 to 9 number, that means it's getting closer to the next stop range, which if we were going from f2 to the next full stop, it would be f2.8. So if we were shooting and it said f2 and then it had a 0.3 at the end, it would be a third of a stop after f2. If it had 0.5, it would be half a stop. If it was 0.7, it would be 2/3. And then after that, when we get past the 0.9, we then go to the next aperture value. Now, if I take a reading again on Anderson's face, it's ranging between 2.8 with a 0 next to it, so pretty much spot on that 2.8 range, and also a 2 and then a 0.8 or a 0.9. And that means that it's much closer to that 2.8 aperture range. Now again, if the image appears to be slightly brighter than you want or slightly darker, this is where you can make those incremental adjustments. spot meters are great as being used as a baseline. You then need to make those alterations based on the overall environment and the scene and the different skin tones and tonalities within the entire frame. Okay, so that's how we measure for more of a daylight scene. Now let's turn over to the nighttime scene. Okay, so now we have our nighttime shot set up, and I'm just going to make some additional changes to the camera and the spot meter to compensate for these adjustments. So I'm going to set my ISO up to 800, and I'm just going to close down my aperture so the image is really dark so we can see how everything adjusts as we're changing things. And I'm just going to change my Kelvin value as well to compensate for the adjustments that have occurred. We're going to be using 4000 Kelvin. And I'm also going to adjust the spot meter to the same 800 value for the ISO, so it's matching. Again, I'm not using an ND filter on the camera, so we don't need to make any additional adjustments to compensate for that. And that's primarily because I can control a lot of the lighting in this studio space. So now we're shooting at nighttime. We want to meter Anderson's face again, but now it's not in direct sunlight. It's probably going to be sitting at a slightly lower value. So first, let's take a meter reading. Now, once again, this is giving us a f2, but then it's also saying a 0.8 after it. And at some other areas, it's giving just a straight f2.8. So again, this is consistently telling us that we should be sitting at around that f2.8 value. So what I'm going to do is I'll bring this to f2.8. And we can now see that this image is far too bright. And again, this is because the spot meter is measuring for middle gray. And although Anderson's skin tones in direct sunlight are going to be sitting at zone 5, in a nighttime scene where his skin tones may be more in shadow, it's potentially going to be sitting at a lower value. So if we look at our zone exposure chart again, we can see that zone 4 and zone 3 could be useful, because zone 5 is where dark skin tones sit for middle gray, but zone 4, which is one stop darker, is landscape shadows, dark stone and dark foliage, and zone 3 is very dark gray with distinct shadows, but they still hold texture. So if I wanted to go to zone 4 from zone 5, I would be taking my aperture value and going from f2.8 to f4. That's one stop darker, taking us to zone 4. If I wanted to go to zone 3, I would go from f4 to f5.6. That's now 2 stops darker. Now for me, once again, I feel as though zone 3 at f5.6 is a little bit too underexposed for my liking, because we're starting to lose a little bit of detail in Anderson's skin tones, and he's beginning to blend into the background a bit too much. So again, like with Matt, I'm going to adjust exposure and place Anderson in zone 4 with an aperture of f4. Again, remember, adjustments of this nature are all personal preference. The spot meter is creating a baseline for you to work from. So hopefully that's given you a better idea of how to expose for darker skin tones as well as Caucasian skin tones.